Hi BookTube, and welcome to another video. This is going to be a wrap-up of the 3 reading challenges that I did throughout 2021. One was self-imposed, a challenge I set myself. The other 2 were fairly regular ones on the BookTube community. That is Non-Fiction November and Reading Women 2021. But I'm going to start with the self-imposed one, and that is, this was my year of reading maximally, where over the 12 months I'd selected 10 books of at least 500 or 600 pages, most were nearer 1,000. Some of which I'd started in previous March of the Mammoths and failed to complete, others that I hadn't cracked open. And I wanted to basically, move them off my to-be-read pile onto my read shelves. And it was my sort of experience of 2 or 3 March of the Mammoth failures to complete the books that I really wanted to tackle head on by choosing this challenge, because I am intimidated by big books. The intimidation is that it seems to exclude all other reading, while, if I'm going to get through them, and the shiny bauble collector in me really struggles with that. So I was basically going to read 10 of these Maximalist books throughout 2021. The 2 months I'd excluded, one was Non-Fiction November and the other was July, when my own latest book, Stories We Tell Our Children, was due to be published, and there would be calls on my time around that. And it started off really well. So in January I read XX by Rhianne Hughes, which was a graphic novel but mainly text. It wasn't sort of graphics on every page, it was more graphic design than sort of illustrations. That was nearly 1,000 pages, but turned out to be a surprisingly quick read. And I read, I think, about 6 or 7 other books in January. February, I read the masterful last novel by Larry Kramer called The American People, Volume 2, The Brutality of Fact. Larry Kramer was one of the earliest campaigners and advocates for the gay community in America in the face of the AIDS crisis. A lot of people weren't alive to it, weren't aware to it and its implications. Kramer was, and Kramer wrote mainly plays at the time, and this book is a furious rage attack on everything around how AIDS was handled or mishandled or even suppressed in the US. He takes no prisoners. He knows he's dying, I think. It doesn't give a damn at this stage. And he's not really saying anything that he hasn't said before. He was alerting us all throughout the AIDS crisis to this sort of stuff. So, Ronald and Nancy Reagan particularly come in for his ire. All the characters are given different names. And it's a satire. And it's not terribly literary, but its fury and rage is to be admired. And Fauci, the American head of health that everybody loves for sort of, trying to alleviate Trump's greater successes over COVID. Well, Fauci was a villain during the AIDS crisis. So, it was a great book. And again, 1,000 pages almost, but surprisingly easy to read. And then March was March of the Mammoths, and we were doing, I say we, because there was a group read with Noah, Everyone Who Reads Must Converse, Kathy Grimm and Dennis, of William Gaddis's The Recognitions, which again clocks in at nearly 1,000 pages. And I will say this was the toughest challenge of them all. This was the most maximalist and dense. And I'm very grateful to the fact that we were reading it together, that helped me, see it through. And we completed it in March as well, which was great. April was a slightly slimmer book, which was Tree of Smoke by Dennis Johnson, his Vietnam novel. The weakest of the books I read, I have to say. But again, it was about, 500, 600 pages. So I'd actually finished it pretty early into the month. And again, could read other books. So I'm 4 for 4 in April. I'm reading other stuff, so, maybe I'd overcome my mental block on this. May was Ducks Newburyport, which made it to my top 10 books of the year. I'd read 300 pages in 2 aborted attempts at reading earlier, including a March of the Mammoths. This time I got through it without any problem the last 700 pages. Wonderful, wonderful book. And then June which was scheduled to be my last read for 2 months, was La Meduza by Vanessa, which Chris over at Leaf by Leaf has just reviewed. I'll put a link to his review of it there in the show notes. And that went slightly into July, a few days into July. Then July I was taking off. The problem was I never really picked up the momentum again after July, and I haven't completed any other of these reads. I did make it to halfway in William Gass's The Tunnel, which is a very, very dense read and very slow going. I definitely want to finish that. I don't think I'm going to be able to do that in December because I myself am writing my own work. And the other book I picked up was James Joyce's Ulysses. I will finish that before the end of the year. So that would mean, assuming I don't do the gas, which I think is likely, that will mean 7 out of 10, which I think is a reasonable hit rate. Does it mean I've overcome my intimidation factor? Well, I've proved to myself that I can still read other books around it, and that they don't exclude reading other books. So that's an important sort of mental adjustment that I've made. And for March of the Mammoths next year, I will be reading J.R. by William Gaddis, which is not as long as the Recognitions. I think maybe slightly more accessible, I'm not sure. And I'm very confident that I will be able to complete that within the month of March. So on that level, again, I think I've partially overcome my block. Having said that, I have no particular yearning to read 6 to 10 maximalist books in any calendar year again. So mixed results, but hopefully I'm over the hump on that one. Okay, on to Non-Fiction November, which is organised by Olive at a Book Olive. She gives 4 single one-word prompts, which I love because they're so open. I finished 3 books against the prompts and had started a 4th. So for the prompt of treatment, I read Being You by Anil, Seth, A New Science of Consciousness. I gave this 4 stars. It's a really good summary of where the science and understanding of human consciousness is right now. It very much fitted in with my own ideas on human consciousness. But it didn't go much beyond a survey of the current thinking on it. So in New Science Consciousness, there wasn't a lot new being advanced here, and what there was, I felt, was very unsubstantiated. And for style, it was The Grammar of Rock by Alexander Theroux, which I haven't finished. I'm a third of the way through this. And what an odd book this is. So it starts off with Theroux talking a bit personally about him as a child and his love of blues music. And then we get into quoting lyrics from all sorts of musicians like the Beatles, Bob Dylan, to more modern musicians as well, which I found surprising because Theroux must be in his 70s or 80s by now, still keeping up to some extent, where he just shows syntactically and grammatically and wrong word choices, just the lyrics make no sense. So he's sort of parsing pop lyrics and sort of staring at them. He'll allow that Dylan wrote good songs, but then he'll point out the Paul song, the word choices that Dylan made in other songs that didn't work. There's no structure to this book. It's just sort of paragraph after paragraph, or at least for the third I've read, paragraph after paragraph after paragraph of song lyrics being deconstructed. There's no chapter breaks, so I'm struggling to get through this because it's just a massive song lyrics being deconstructed. That may change. We may get more on the personal story of Alexander Theroux again. I don't know, but I am struggling with this. I will happily report, though, that he really, really dislikes both country music and Barry Manilow. More power to his elbow for that. And on to, I'm just trying to think, Mary Douglas, Purity and Danger. What was this for? Oh, this was for the prompt collection, because this is a collection of taboos. Now, this was a reread for me. And it was a really odd experience because the standout chapter this time round was exactly the standout chapter last time round. And my feelings about the whole book hasn't really changed. That chapter is worth the price of admission alone. The rest of the book was sort of meh. And a bit like the Consciousness book, it took on a lot of the current thinking of the time, because this was written a long time ago, about sort of taboos and sort of collective behaviour and convention and stuff in tribes, and sort of debunked them without really offering any cogent arguments to replace them. The standout chapter is about the sort of food prescriptions in Leviticus and why some animals are named specifically and others are just sort of said birds or fishes. And she says, well, the reason for that is because the animals that are named specifically are the ones that sort of muddy the waters. There's no clear distinction. The Jewish prescription is you can only eat animals that chew the cud and have a cloven hoof. So the pig has a cloven hoof, but it doesn't chew the cud. So that's why the pig is specifically adumbrated as verboten. So yeah, I was surprised that my views hadn't really changed. I hadn't really remembered the book terribly well. It came back to me as I was reading it, but my views on it hadn't really changed. And for the last prompt, industry, it was a book by Cal Flynn called Islands of Abandonment, which is about sort of what it says, sort of abandoned communities and constructions and environments, such as the most bombed place during World War One, Paterson, New Jersey, which is the first sort of purpose-built industrial town in America, and all these sorts of things. They've all been abandoned because of the toxicity and the blight on the environment and stuff. And there was some interesting things. I didn't know that Paterson, New Jersey was a purpose-built town under the sort of vision of Alexander Hamilton. Things like that were interesting, but I was slightly taken aback because it's an environmental book where Cal Flynn was sort of much more hopeful than I am about nature's ability to bounce back. For example, that where you've got all these heavy metals in the earth, be it through bombardment in the First World War or industrial runoff waste, that there are certain plants which will suck up these hard metals from the earth and remove them from the earth and stuff. So she was quite confident that there were models of Mother Nature bouncing back from these blighted areas. And I'm not denying what she's saying, but I didn't share the overall optimism that these would be present the solutions to what we're doing to our planet. And I was a bit nonplussed by her sort of bouncy positivism, really. So that was my non-fiction November. I have to say, probably the least successful in terms of the books that I chose, sort of giving me pleasure and satisfaction. None of them really blew me away. Now, obviously, that's not the prompts. That's my choice of books to go against them. But, I'm still looking forward to doing it next year. And finally, onto the Reading Women Challenge. There were 24 challenges plus some bonuses. I didn't do any of the bonuses. I have to say, I thought some of these prompts were so specific that they became absolutely prescriptive. I managed 16 of the 24, so 2/3. I will say that I don't sit out at the start of the year with this list in hand and go, okay, I'm going to buy a book for that prompt, a book for that. I use it more to monitor, to make sure that I'm reading sufficient women authors. Because there's no doubt about it that having done this challenge for the last 3 years now, it's increased the amount of books by women and brought up my awareness of books by women in certain areas that I wasn't aware of them. So particularly, say, experimental fiction, which is up till recently been dominated by American men. So I find this challenge really helpful in that respect, but I don't do it in a proactive way. I do it in a sort of monitoring way. Okay, so the first challenge was longlisted for the Jcb Prize, which is an Indian literature prize. I had nothing for that. 2, author from Eastern Europe. Surprisingly, I didn't have anything for that for this year because I've read Dessa Drindich, I've read Dubravka Ugresic, these sorts of writers. But it just so happened this year I haven't read anything by a woman from Eastern Europe. 3, about incarceration. The whole book that I'm about to say is not about incarceration, but there is significant chunks of it that are. And it's by Tice Chen, and it's called Keeping the House, and it's about sort of the experience of Turks and Kurds in London, who unfortunately are very much associated with the drugs trade, and one of the husbands of one of the main characters is in jail, and there's you know, some fantastic descriptions of his wife bringing their very young children into the prison visiting room for a prison visit, which I actually thought was the best bit of the book, which otherwise I found a bit disappointing. 4, a cookbook by a woman of colour. I'm sorry, I'm never going to read a cookbook. I can understand a sort of cookbook which goes into the history of the food or the culinary tradition that it's dealing with, but an actual cookbook, I'm never going to buy. I'm never going to read. And then to further filter it down by a woman of colour, this was never going to be possible for me, I'm afraid. 5, a protagonist older than 50. Well, I read Mrs. Dalloway for the first time, and I think she's older than 50. Otherwise, there's The Performance by Claire Thomas, a wonderful novel set in a theatre during a performance of Samuel Beckett's, what's it called? Happy Days. And one of the 3 main female protagonists there is over 50. 6, South American author in translation. Well, I read a couple of books by Chilean authors, Nona Fernandez, Space Invaders, and Lina Meruan's Nervous System. I also read another Clarice Lispector book, so yeah, Clarice Lispector's one of my favourite authors, and I've still got at least 2 more of her books to read. 7, reread a favourite. Well, I don't normally reread at all. I limit myself to 2 books a year, although this year I broke that and read 3. And I can't honestly say it's a favourite, but it was a reread. And that was for Non-Fiction November as well also. It's Mary Douglas's Purity and Danger. 8, memoir by an Indigenous woman. Well, I didn't read a memoir, but I did read the inestimably wonderful Nupamine by Leanne Samoa Simpson, a Canadian First Nation. It's a wonderful book and embraces a lot of her culture, but it's not strictly a memoir. 9, by a neurodivergent author. I read Anne Quinn's Passages. Anne Quinn was that most rare creature, being a female avant-garde author in the 1960s. Everyone's heard of B.S. Johnson, but Anne Quinn was a contemporary of his, and unfortunately had, was put in sanatoriums several times with her mental illness. A crime novel or a thriller in translation. So I read The Taiga Syndrome by Cristina Rivera Garza, who lives in America, but I think this was first published in Spanish because she's of Mexican heritage. It's not a crime thriller, but it is a thriller in that a woman, Private Eye, who's retired, comes out of retirement and goes into this strange sort of tundra environment called the Taiga, after this couple who've disappeared into there. I really enjoyed that book. 11, About the Natural World. Well, there's a collection of poetry by the German Anna Croissant-Rust called Death, in which the whole second half is her nature poems. It was around the turn of the 20th century, so sort of 1898, something like that. 12, young adult novel by a Latinx author. Well, I don't read young adult novels at all, and again, to sort of further filter it to a Latinx author, I think that shows somewhat American bias to me. 13, a poetry collection by a black woman. This was my poetry book of the year. It was Roya Marsh's Daylight, absolutely wonderful collection. 14, a biracial protagonist. I had a couple for this. One was the aforementioned The Performance by Claire Thomas, where there's a half Aboriginal girl. But there was also Lote by Shola von Reinhold, which is very central to the plot of that book. 15, a Muslim middle grade novel. Again, I'm afraid I had nothing for this because I don't read middle grade stuff at all. 16, a queer love story. I've gone for one of the, La Meduza by Vanessa Place is a polyphonic novel, but one of the central parts of it is a secret lesbian affair of 2 married women as their husbands are outside shooting the breeze with beers. They are inside, maintaining their long-term relationship. 17, about a woman in politics. I had nothing for this. I was really surprised. I mean, Mrs. Dalloway is the wife of an MP, but that's exactly what this challenge wants to get away from, being the wife of. So I'm afraid I had nothing for that, which I was surprised and disappointed at. 18, a rural setting. So I read The High House by Jessie Greengrass, which is a end of the world environmental disaster novel of rising tides. And the only safe place for the people that we follow is a really high up rural house in the Highlands of Scotland. 19, a cover design by a woman. I'm assuming this is, believe it or not, it doesn't say who the cover design is by, but Little Scratch by Rebecca Watson was the novel. I think it might, I find this hard to believe that the author themselves was allowed to do a cover, but I can't find who did the cover, so I'm assuming that it was, but I could be wrong on that. 20, an Arab author in translation. Well, I'm not sure strictly whether this counts. As I said, Lina Merouane is Chilean of Palestinian descent. I assume she's second generation Chilean, so that it was her parents who moved to Chile. But her wonderful novel Nervous System, which made it to my top 10 reads of the year, would be my choice for that. 21, by a trans author. I read several books by trans authors, but the most obvious one is Detransition Baby by Tori Peters. There's also A Divorcer, a collection of short stories by Gary Lutz, although, does it say? No, it just says by a trans author, it doesn't have to be a novel. And The Subtweet by Vivek Shraya. 22, fantasy novel by an Asian author, don't read fantasy. 23, non-fiction focus on social justice. Well, I went for Lucy Ellmann's Things Are Against Us. Lucy Ellmann, who wrote Duck's Nude Report. She wrote a book of essays which sort of echoes a lot of the things that were dealt with in Duck's Nude Report. And I have to say, they were dealt with better in fiction than in her non-fiction. And then finally, a short story collection by a Caribbean author. I read very little short story collections, and this year I didn't read one by a Caribbean woman. So there you have it. That was, as I say, 16 out of 24 of the prompts met, which is not bad. There were at least 3 or 4 prompts I just felt were so prescriptive. I mean, I'm annoyed I didn't read anything by a woman from Eastern Europe. I'm annoyed I didn't manage to read anything about a woman in politics. So some of them, if I'd thought harder, I could have met maybe. But that's it. That's my summary of my 3 reading challenges for 2021. At the moment, I don't have any for 2022. I assume Non-Fiction November will be a thing again, and I would like to participate in that. But other than that, I don't have any in mind. So if any of you guys are aware of ones that are happening, I'm not talking about the regular ones like Shake Tube, although I now know it's called Shaketober or something. I don't participate in that. I don't participate in Victober because I don't read Victorian novels. Bloody blah. You know what I like. So if anyone's aware of likely challenges for next year, please let me know. So till next time, thanks very much.